Hello again, this is Dr. Keane-Dawes, and we are focusing on this sort of second part of the lecture with a focus on women in colonial societies and economies, right? Talking about the relations to them. So I wanted to do something different because I didn't quite find a video that could focus on this topic per se, well, not in English anyway. And so I recorded this video, kind of going through the slides, not necessarily focusing on the notes, for us to get a sense of how this topic is related to our unit, right? Of a sense and looking at colonial Latin American society, right? And so I would like to begin, right, as we switch gears, with an overview of women in colonial Latin American society. So, an overview of women in colonial Latin and colonial society. Within the parameters of race and social standing, gender played the most important role in an individual's place in colonial Latin America. As we established earlier, colonial society was patriarchal, which reflected in the activities and roles of men and women. For example, men held all civil offices, made political decisions, and usually, but not always, dominated the most lucrative economic activities. Men performed the heavy manual labors of fields and mines, constructed buildings and ships, worked on roads, and transported goods. They performed military service and could secure a higher education. But a general summary such as this one really does not capture the complexities of social and economic reality of colonial life. It hides the full extent of the important contributions of women. For example, elite women managed the vast and complex holdings of mines, real estate, and agricultural properties. In situations where the husband was absent, women across the board filled their traditional economic positions as landlords, ranchers, and artisans. Furthermore, they dominated public markets as buyers and sellers. Few rural and urban working class families could survive on one income, which is another place for the woman's contribution, right? So essentially, gender plays an important role in an individual's place in colonial Latin American society. And when I talk about gender, gender refers to the role of a woman or a man or a child within a larger society, right? It's sort of in relation, in context. And one example of gender, especially in this context, are the roles, prescribed roles of society that a male or female take, right? What are the roles that make someone a man in colonial Latin American society? What are the roles that make a woman in colonial Latin American society, right? Which I said a little bit earlier has to do with the activities and the roles, right? And so if it's roles in the government, if it has to do with those decisions or lucrative economic activities, manual labor, as we mentioned earlier, constructing buildings, etc., those were actions attributed to men, and that's what creates the role of a man in colonial Latin American society, right? If we're following. But when you dig below the surface, when you go beneath the surface, you realize that the ideal, right? So the ideal, as in this is what the ideal man would do in colonial Latin American society, dominate political offices, engage in these lucrative economic activities, isn't always the reality. And as so far as we're talking about the important contributions of women, right? As we're looking here at this painting, right, of a family, husband, wife, and child, and it does not highlight the role of the woman, the role of the mother, right? We sort of gave some examples here, right? So, in the absence of a husband, right, elite women manage their holdings of mines, their real estate, their agricultural properties, took on those positions that would be attributed to a male, like we said, with landlords and ranchers and artisans, and in the sphere of public markets, dominated, right? Dominated because they were there either as buyers for their family to supply their home or with someone that would supply their home, or as sellers, right? Selling goods to support their family, right? And so, this idea that that families survived on one income, unless you were super elite, was false, right? Needing two incomes. Now, let's look at the kind of work that women did on the outside. And so, women working outside of the home. In rural spaces, women often worked outside of the home on sugar estates and smaller cane farms in Brazil, right? Depended on the labor of enslaved and free women. The wives and children of independent farmers and ranchers helped them with their labor. Women sold handicrafts and foodstuff in urban and rural markets. Textile manufacturing was something that females ran and worked in serving as owners. We see that in some crafts, such as bakeries, women own 1/3 of them in places such as Guadalajara in 1769, right, a city in Mexico. In artisan trades, where the rules forbade women to work, the wives of these masters assisted them in preparing raw materials and maintaining tools. Now, elite households needed female domestics to clean, cook, and serve as wet nurses, which, if you don't know what a wet nurse is, it's when you hire someone to breastfeed your baby. Often these women were not free, right? Talking about the domestics and the wet nurses. For instance, early in the colonial era, the Spanish forced indigenous women to serve a master. Afterward, the African slave trade provided more women to be servants. Female slaves, in fact, were often a part of a dowry, which suggests that Iberians believed they were required in a decent household. Poor free women also made up the servant body and were almost indistinguishable from their enslaved counterparts. But the free woman could always seek alternative employment, and women were less likely to suffer corporal punishment, right? Talking about the free woman, right? So women outside of the home, right? As a way to sort of dispel that notion, even if it were a imagination, or maybe not imagination is not the word, but a idealized type. If you weren't a part of the elite, you were not working just inside the home, working outside of the home, particularly when talking about rural spaces. So we think back, to our examples of sugar estates and cane farms. Women and children were involved in that work, right? Right, we were talking about markets a little bit earlier. So in urban and rural markets, women were involved in the selling, right? And all this, right, to help support their families. Now, when there were certain sort of fields of work, like textile manufacturing, this was something that we see more of a female presence, right? We think back earlier to that example in Guadalajara. And even in areas where women were forbidden to work, such as the artisan trades, they still helped their families, right? So this is to say that there are very few professions in colonial Latin American society that are not impacted by women in one form or another, as I'm kind of going through these different examples. And even if we're looking at women working within the home of an elite person, then you're thinking about the need for domestics, right? Servants to clean, to cook, even to serve as wet nurses, which, I had said a little bit earlier, and it was something used by elite women who didn't nurse their children, right? And oftentimes drawing on enslaved women to do these chores, although not always, right? First, it was beginning with indigenous women and then African women, right? And so within the mix of these domestics, it's a mix of free and enslaved or forced labor, right? And so it's kind of spread out across the board. But again, just to sort of highlight the importance of women, right? Them working outside of the home, their contribution to colonial society and to their families, right? So let's take a look at the family responsibilities within the household for women. So household and family responsibilities. Society linked the main responsibility of wives in elite and mid-level families to managing the home. Such associations with the home included bearing and rearing children, managing domestic affairs, and instilling cultural values. Even though Iberians called for married women to devote themselves as mothers and wives, they spend time looking after the family's economic well being as well. In fact, when their husbands went away to maintain distant investments or undertaking commercial ventures, wives dealt with the day to day responsibilities for managing properties or shops. Widows who came from the property sectors of society enjoyed the most freedom and participated the most in colonial economies. For instance, widows in Spanish America enjoyed full control over their dowries and would receive half of the wealth acquired during marriage. They also administered the inheritance of the children while they were minors. Later on during the colonial period, women could own and operate rural and urban properties with the aid of male relatives. These widows could pass on property directly to their daughters through their hard work, and through their hard work could multiply a family's assets, right? So, even though the main responsibility by society was managing the home, and again, this was for elite and mid-level, right, middle class women, because women that were poorer, right, that a second income was needed, right? So it's not necessarily considered in that sense. But still, right, even though they devoted themselves as mothers and wives, they still spent time looking after their family's economic well-being, and we can't understate that enough. On top of the responsibilities of bearing and rearing children, right, and instilling cultural values, right? We kind of went over some examples earlier, right? So while the husband was away, dealing with those day-to-day responsibilities that were important for managing properties or shops, right? Again, looking after the family's well-being. And in that sense, women who were widows, who had been married, would find these opportunities that emerge because of this space they inhabited, right? Having been married, having had wealth, and with the passing away of their husband, having inherited that wealth. And so they were in a unique position in the sense of the examples given earlier, controlling your dowry, right, which is the property and money that you come into the marriage with, and being able to use that wealth, right, and then in being the supervisors of the children of their inheritance while they were minors, sort of taking care of them, and even being able to monitor and to work with property, right? Even if it's just having a male surrogate, right, that representative, it's just interesting that women in this space are able to do that, particularly if you think about what we've been saying so far about women in their role in colonial Latin American society. And so even with the role of widowed women, they could pass on property directly to their daughters. And with that, being able to multiply a family's asset, right? Because again, we're talking about the building up of a family, and how the family, as we said earlier, kind of serves this role to move up economically, right? Helping one another, creating those kinships, creating those bonds, and what that sort of leads to, all right? And so that brings us to the end of this part of the lecture, right? And so we just need to keep in mind when thinking about women in colonial societies and economies, keep in mind first thinking about the idealized version, I should say, of the role of men and women sometimes didn't fit the reality, right? The sense that women had to stay home, not engage in things like politics, and at least for upper class men, allowing them to handle the business. When in reality, that was not the case, right? Depending on place, depending on when those people were born, kind of dictated those things, right? And nevertheless, we see different examples of women engaging in the marketplace, working, especially if you're lower class, in the sense of needing the money and those opportunities, and even taking that interest in terms of education from others, right? They're parts of the family. And keeping in mind too, even the roles that widows could take upon in terms of the family structure, right? So that's all for now. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know. If not, I will talk to you all soon. Take care now. Bye.